The train always feels different on the way home than it does in the morning. In the morning, it's full of purpose. Everyone carries the same expression, somewhere between determination and surrender, staring at phones, coffee cups, or the dark reflection in the windows as if one of them might reveal a shortcut through another workday. On the ride home, though, something changes. The tension melts into exhaustion. Jackets are unbuttoned, ties loosened. Conversations are quieter. Even the announcements seem softer somehow. I usually spend the ride scrolling through meaningless videos or pretending to read whatever book I've been carrying for 3 months without getting past chapter 4. Tonight, however, I haven't looked at my phone once. The city slides past the windows in blurred streaks of orange and blue, but I'm barely seeing it. My mind has been replaying the same conversation over and over again, one that happened 2 days ago in the most ordinary place imaginable, the supermarket. It's strange how memories choose their own importance. I can't remember what I ate for lunch yesterday without thinking for a full minute, yet I can remember exactly where she was standing when I saw her. She was in the produce section, comparing 2 bags of avocados with the concentration of someone making a life-changing decision. I almost walked right past her. In fact, I did walk past her. It was only after taking 3 more steps that something clicked in my head. I turned around because my brain had finally attached a name to a face I hadn't seen in over a decade. She looked up at almost the exact same moment, and I watched recognition spread across her face just as slowly. There was a second where we both seemed unsure whether pretending not to notice each other would be less awkward than acknowledging reality. Unfortunately for both of us, we smiled at exactly the same time. She said my name first. It caught me off guard because I honestly wasn't sure she'd remember me. We had graduated 12 years ago. We had never been friends. I don't think we had ever had an actual conversation back then. Maybe we'd exchanged a few words during group assignments or while waiting for a teacher to arrive, but nothing beyond that. We had occupied completely different worlds despite spending years inside the same building. I smiled back, probably looking far more surprised than polite, and answered with her name. We both laughed immediately after saying each other's names, as if acknowledging how absurd this whole situation was. Then came the universal question everyone asks in moments like these. So, how have you been? The funny thing about that question is that nobody expects an honest answer. It's less of a question and more of a social bridge to avoid silence. Still, we both answered sincerely enough. We talked about work first. She asked what I was doing these days, and I explained that I worked in IT, mostly solving problems people accidentally created for themselves. She laughed more than I expected, saying every office had someone who survived entirely by fixing mistakes other people insisted weren't their fault. She told me she worked in urban planning now. I admitted I barely understood what that involved, and instead of giving the rehearsed professional explanation, she described it by saying, "Basically, I argue with maps all day." That made me laugh harder than it probably should have. We started walking almost without deciding to. She had a basket in one hand. I had a cart that contained exactly 3 items because I had only stopped to buy milk and pasta after work. Somehow, those 3 items became irrelevant. We drifted together through the aisles, stopping whenever one of us remembered something we needed. The conversation kept threatening to die, then somehow finding another branch to grow from. It was awkward in the way conversations between strangers often are, except we weren't strangers. We shared the years of history without actually sharing any memories together. That created a strange kind of familiarity. We knew the same teachers, remembered the same school events, and could instantly understand references that would mean nothing to anyone else. Eventually, we started talking about school itself, which I had been secretly hoping to avoid. High school is one of those places people romanticize after enough time passes. My memories are less nostalgic. They aren't traumatic either, just uncomfortable, like wearing shoes half a size too small for 4 years. I wasn't bullied relentlessly, but I wasn't invisible enough to escape attention either. Mostly, I kept my head down. She, on the other hand, had belonged to what everyone casually called the cool kids. Looking back now, cool kids feels like a generous description. They weren't villains from a movie, but they certainly weren't kind. They knew exactly who belonged near the top of the social ladder and who didn't. Sometimes the cruelty was intentional. Sometimes it came from simply never considering how other people felt. At 16, those two things often looked identical. I don't think she ever bullied me directly. If you had asked teenage me, I probably would have included her among the people I avoided anyway. She was always surrounded by confident, loud people who seemed to possess some secret manual explaining how popularity worked. I remember assuming they all thought exactly alike. That's what teenagers do. We flatten people into categories because it's easier than accepting everyone is complicated. Nerd, athlete, popular, weird, invisible. Once someone receives a label, everything they do gets filtered through it. Standing beside her in aisle 7 while she debated which cereal had less sugar, I realized how absurd those labels looked now. She apologized because her basket was getting heavier and asked if she could put it inside my cart. The request was so casual and natural that it made me smile. For the next 15 minutes, we shared a shopping cart like we'd planned the trip together. I found that oddly funny. Had someone from school seen us, they'd probably assume we'd always been close friends. Reality couldn't have been further away. The conversation slowly became easier. She asked thoughtful questions instead of waiting for her turn to speak. When I mentioned my parents were getting older, she didn't immediately change the subject. She asked how they were doing, remembered my father had been a mechanic because she'd apparently heard me mention it once during school, and somehow recalled details I'd forgotten ever sharing. That surprised me. Most people only remember information that somehow benefits them. She remembered small things because she genuinely listened, even back then, despite us barely interacting. At one point, I joked that adulthood mostly consisted of comparing supermarket prices and getting excited whenever laundry finished drying before bedtime. She laughed and nodded with such enthusiasm that another shopper looked at us briefly. "Nobody warns you," she said. "When you're 16, you think adulthood is about freedom. Nobody tells you it's mostly about deciding whether toilet paper is cheaper in packs of 12 or 24. There was something refreshing about the way she talked. No performance, no trying to sound impressive, just observations delivered with quiet humor. I realized I'd expected someone who had once been effortlessly popular to spend the entire conversation talking about achievements or traveling or expensive hobbies. Instead, she was genuinely excited because she'd recently learned how to grow herbs on her apartment balcony without killing them. By the time we reached the checkout lines, I had completely forgotten how awkward the conversation had started. We waited in neighboring positions as customers slowly unloaded impossible amounts of groceries onto the conveyor belts. The cashier scanned items with robotic speed while we continued talking across the divider. I don't even remember what the topic was anymore. I only remember thinking that 20 minutes had somehow disappeared. Outside, the evening air had cooled considerably. We walked toward the parking lot together because our cars happened to be parked in roughly the same direction. Neither of us seemed eager to end the conversation, although neither of us admitted it either. We just kept slowing our pace without mentioning it. That's when the conversation changed. She noticed a shopping cart sitting alone in the middle of 2 parking spaces. Without interrupting whatever she had been saying, she walked over, grabbed it, and pushed it all the way back to the cart return area. It took maybe 30 seconds. Such a tiny thing. Yet somehow it stuck with me because she didn't do it dramatically. She didn't make a joke about being responsible or complain about people being lazy. She simply saw something that should be fixed and fixed it. When she came back, I laughed and asked whether she always did that. She shrugged. Usually, it makes someone else's day slightly easier. The answer lingered in my mind longer than I expected. We ended up talking about people in general, about how easy it is to become cynical after spending enough years reading headlines and arguing online. She said something I haven't stopped thinking about since. I think most people aren't good or bad. They're just busy. Sometimes kindness loses to exhaustion. It wasn't presented as some profound philosophical statement. She said it while adjusting one of the grocery bags in her trunk. Yet something about it landed differently. Maybe because it sounded earned instead of rehearsed. It didn't excuse selfishness, but it acknowledged how complicated life becomes. I realized I'd never thought about kindness that way. We kept talking for another 15 minutes in the parking lot. The sun had almost disappeared by then, leaving that strange blue light that makes everything feel quieter. Somehow, we ended up discussing how people change over time. She admitted she sometimes looked back at her teenage self with embarrassment. I wasn't mean on purpose most of the time, she said slowly. But I don't think I noticed people outside my circle enough. That's another way of hurting people. I didn't answer immediately. She continued before I could. When you're young, you think everyone experiences school the way you do. Then you grow up and hear someone else's version of those same years, and it's like discovering you attended two completely different schools. I found myself nodding because she was right. She looked at me for a second before asking quietly, "Were you happy back then?" It was probably the most honest question anyone had asked me in months. I thought about lying, saying it was fine, saying everyone survives high school. Instead, I smiled faintly. Not really. She looked genuinely sad hearing that. Not guilty, not defensive, just sad. I'm sorry. Those two words were simple. She wasn't apologizing for a specific event. She wasn't taking responsibility for every unpleasant thing that happened years ago. She was acknowledging that my experience existed. That mattered more than I expected. I told her it was okay because life had improved afterward, and that was true. High school eventually becomes 4 years inside a much larger life, important while you're living it, surprisingly small once enough time passes. She smiled. I'm glad. There was a warmth in those words that caught me completely off guard. Eventually, we realized we'd been standing beside our cars for nearly 20 minutes. We laughed about accidentally turning a supermarket trip into a reunion neither of us had planned. Before leaving, she asked if it would be okay if we stayed in touch occasionally. Again, I was surprised. I said yes, and we exchanged numbers with the slightly awkward excitement of two adults discovering they might actually enjoy knowing each other after spending years assuming otherwise. Then she drove away. I stood there for another minute before getting into my own car. For some reason, I couldn't stop smiling. Now, sitting on this train 2 days later, I'm still thinking about it. Not because anything dramatic happened, nothing life-changing occurred. Nobody confessed to hidden feelings. Nobody discovered a shocking secret. It was just a conversation. Two adults buying groceries on a Tuesday evening, yet somehow it felt important. Maybe because it challenged a story I'd been carrying around for over a decade. Memory is strange. It freezes people. The versions of them living inside our heads stop aging while the real people continue moving through life. Without realizing it, I'd preserved an image of her as an 18-year-old standing with the loudest group in the hallway. Confident, untouchable, probably judgmental. Meanwhile, she'd lived another 12 years that I knew absolutely nothing about. She'd experienced disappointments, victories, mistakes, grief, work, responsibility, and everything else adulthood quietly piles onto us. Of course she changed. We all do. The strange thing is that I changed too. If teenage me had somehow watched that conversation in the supermarket, he probably wouldn't have believed it. He would have assumed she was pretending. He would have searched for hidden motives because that's what insecurity teaches you to do. Adult me didn't feel that need. Maybe because I've learned people rarely fit the stories we invent about them. The train slows as it approaches another station. More people step inside carrying backpacks, shopping bags, and tired expressions that mirror my own. I find myself wondering how many of them are carrying outdated versions of someone else in their heads. An old friend they assume hasn't changed. A teacher they still resent. A family member frozen in a single painful memory. Maybe we're all walking around surrounded by ghosts of people who no longer exist. Change is difficult to notice when it happens gradually. We expect dramatic transformations, movie moments where someone suddenly becomes wiser overnight. Real life is quieter than that. One conversation at a time. One mistake learned from. One difficult year survived. One act of kindness repeated until it becomes instinct. Maybe that's all growing up really is. I keep thinking about the way she returned that shopping cart without expecting anyone to notice. About how carefully she listened before answering questions. About how she admitted regret without drowning in guilt. There was an awareness about her that I never would have associated with the girl I remembered from school. She seemed deeply conscious of herself and of other people, as if somewhere along the road she'd learned that everyone carries invisible stories. That quiet awareness impressed me more than any career success or accomplishment could have. The train enters the tunnel before my station and the windows become mirrors again. I catch my own reflection looking back at me. A 30-year-old man with dark circles under his eyes, a work bag resting between his shoes, and thoughts that seem much older than the face staring back. Then I wonder something I hadn't considered until now. If she was so different from the person I remembered, what would people from school think if they met me today? Would they still picture the quiet guy who avoided attention and rarely spoke unless spoken to? Would they notice how much easier conversations have become? Would they realize I built a life I genuinely like? Or are they carrying an outdated version of me just as I carried one of her? The thought makes me smile. Maybe that's the real lesson from an ordinary Tuesday evening in a supermarket. Not that people deserve endless second chances because some truly don't change. Not that every memory is wrong because some remain painfully accurate. The lesson is simpler than that. We shouldn't assume time leaves people untouched. Sometimes the person we're avoiding only exists inside our memory. Sometimes the stranger standing in front of us has spent years becoming someone entirely different. The train finally reaches my station. The doors slide open with the familiar mechanical chime, and everyone stands almost simultaneously, moving toward the exit with practiced efficiency. I pick up my bag and step onto the platform. The cool evening air greets me as I climb the stairs toward street level. Tomorrow will probably look exactly like today. Work, emails, meetings, another train ride home. Life rarely announces when it's about to hand you something meaningful. Sometimes it simply hides it between the avocados in the cereal aisle, waiting for two people who spent years misunderstanding each other to finally have their first real conversation.